So I'm Dr Niall Munro. I'm standing in front of New College in Oxford with my colleague Dr Tinashe Mushakavanhu, and we're going to talk a little bit about how it was for Dambudzo Marechera to arrive in Oxford. This is his college. This is the college he eventually left through difficult circumstances. But Tinashe, maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what it was like for him to arrive here in 1974. Do you know what he was expecting? What was it like for him to kind of get here in a completely different environment to the one he was normally used to?
Marechera had been a student at University of Rhodesia from 1972, and a year later was expelled for leading student protests. So a group of benefactors helped him get a scholarship to Oxford. So then he moved to Oxford in 1974 and arrived in a very dramatic fashion. Took a cab from Heathrow to Oxford.
That would have been expensive.
At the expense of the college. So that's pretty much how Marechera arrives in Oxford. But I think one of the most fascinating things I learned was how he was pretty much preparing himself for Oxford. So he started reading about the history of New College. So in his correspondence to the warden, to the various officials of the college, he started referencing different characters from the past of New College, and so there's a sense in which he was anticipating his move to Oxford, becoming part of maybe a lineage of writers. So there was something already premeditative about his sense of self, or his sense of himself as a writer.
And that seems very typical of Marechera in many ways. He was an extraordinary reader, and he read so much. And so it would always be sensible that he would do his research by doing a lot of reading about what it was going to be like to get here. Do you think when he got here he was surprised? Is there anything in his writings which suggests the kind of experience that he had, visceral experience that he had when he got here, confronting? Because looking around now, the street won't have changed radically from when he was here. It's really quite quiet sort of side street off some of the main streets, and there are lots of little houses and accommodation around here, but generally speaking the college itself is a pretty vast building, and he must have had quite a sort of visceral reaction to seeing this kind of ancient structure, things that he wasn't necessarily kind of used to.
It was a big shock. Marechera grew up in a very small town in the east of Zimbabwe, and he spent most of his life, I think, up until he was almost 21 before he moved to university. So he had just grown up in this very small town, away from the capital city. And I think the first big shock for Marechera was when he moved to University of Rhodesia. So he stayed on campus, So and the campus was a bubble, and that was the first time Marechera is starting to encounter, racial conflict. Being discriminated away from maybe the white parts of the city, white experiences of Zimbabwe. So the reason he's expelled from University of Rhodesia is because these protests are about the discrimination of black students. And so when he comes to Oxford, that's the second biggest shock. He's now entrenched in sort of in the white academy. And it's riotous on his mind, on his sense of on his sense of self, on where he is, on his identity, on everything, and I think that his existence in Oxford became an existence of reacting to that shock.
I get the sense that to begin with he was quite keen to do well, and that he did the reading, and he met the tutors, and he was applying himself in the way I suppose that Oxford kind of expected him to apply himself, like all the other students. But then gradually he kind of falls out with that, with the tutors, with the kind of ideas that Oxford is kind of sort of imposing on him as ways of thinking. Is that fair?
I mean, it's a fair reading. I think that he, in a sense, he just builds an alternative curriculum for himself. So the ideas of reading, the pursuit of reading, is still important to him. So even as he refuses to participate in the tutorial system, he continues to read, he continues to expand his mind, he continues to do all the things that are important in him as a person, the things that are important in his writing career, in his writing project. He builds them on his own terms. So I think there's just a refusal to participate in the system, in the curriculum, and being part of Oxford.
Those kind of structures that he didn't, that kind of discipline that he wasn't necessarily subscribing to. So he had an alternative way of looking at what he was supposed to be doing. So that's very interesting. So in a way, he was using Oxford, or he was using the facilities, the resources of the college, of the university, in order to kind of expand his own horizons, but in a different direction.
That's precisely what happens. I think once he arrives, he's a genuinely curious, genuinely interested person. So he gets invested in every space he lives in, So he is not detached, So whatever is happening, the tussle that's happening, the tensions that grow, around his living arrangements, around his relationships within the college, it's still a way of relating with space, so it brings up his own, traumas. From Rhodesia, from Zimbabwe, the traumas of living in England in the 1970s, when there are also racial tensions broadly across the country. So there's so much that is going on, and I think in the end, all of these tensions, coalesce into his writings. So that becomes the basis of his fiction, the basis of of who he becomes later on.
And it is really interesting that you said, and in a way, perhaps the students, maybe at the time, students now, maybe don't get involved so much in the community. He actually is somebody who is very outward-looking, and he, as you're mentioning, he gets involved in protests, workers' rights protests in Oxford. He joins, marches. He joins protests against injustice as he sees it. Which, in a way, I suppose maybe some students were much more kind of involved in college activities. Maybe they were, behind these kind of closed doors, and they sort of did all their hard work studying, whereas he resists that to the point where he actually becomes much more kind of Oxford than maybe much more involved in Oxford as a place, as a community, than some of those students did.
Yeah, definitely. I think he takes personally the divide between gown and town, because for him he wants the full Oxford experience, and the full Oxford experience means walking out of college, means sitting with workers from car manufacturing industries. It means relating with people cleaning the colleges. So he is invested in everyone. I think and there's an acknowledgement of his own privilege. The fact that he's a student at Oxford, he's in that sense already privileged and entitled, but that is not his background. He comes from nothing, so he identifies with all these workers who are keeping Oxford alive, and so there's an active search for that community, because I think that's also what happens in a place like that. What can easily happen in a place like Oxford is how sheltered you become, how removed you become from everyday struggles. And I think part of the disorientation and the shock for Marechera is when everything that was familiar to him as a child growing up in Rhodesia is suddenly doesn't exist. I think that is pretty much maybe where the dissonance happens and fractures his relationship with the institution.
And eventually there is that break. So how does that manifest itself? How does he end up leaving the college?
It's a series of things. I think he was in college for almost probably just over 18 months, and it's a series of events that lead to him being sent down.
Which in Oxford terms means basically expelled. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. But from a college point of view, not a university point of view.
From a college point of view, because I think he just becomes disruptive because college life is very much social, so he becomes more disruptive. Instead of attending tutorials, he spends the day sleeping and wakes up at night and plays out loud music, gets drunk. He becomes abusive, and probably the most told legend is that he tried to burn down the college library. So anyway, there's a series of things that leads up to his expulsion. But the warden at the time, Lord Sehater, wanted him to stay, or wanted to help him, wanted him to get a soft landing from the college after the expulsion. So they're trying to work out what happens if he leaves. So even the leaving is not necessarily abrupt. It's a planned exit. The institution works hard behind the scenes to try and find possible avenues for him to take. And one of the discussions that was happening in the university, for example, was for him to return to Rhodesia, but a lot of his former tutors discouraged against that, because Rhodesia was still a very political space. The liberation struggle was accelerating, and they didn't want Marechera to be in trouble. And then the second alternative was for him to go to Zambia and become a school teacher. So the college started talking to the British Council, to diplomats, to different people, trying to work out an exit strategy for Marechera. None of these things work out. So in the end, Marechera just leaves the college and nobody knows where he is. And I guess in that sense, his homelessness begins, and then it becomes a recurring pattern in his life.